So, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Bonn, those of you who are not here. It's Sunday afternoon in Bonn. I know what I would be doing this afternoon on a Sunday at home, but please don't do that here. We'll try and keep you awake. And please also bear with me if I have to pause. I've got a shocking cold, and I may need to make a rush for a glass of water or handkerchief or something. This is quite an unsettling time in the world. Many of the problems that society has been grappling with for generations are coming to a head. There's growing inequality, there's a swelling migrant crisis, devastating string of natural disasters fueled by climate change, there's instability in our democracies, and there's an erosion of trust in the institutions. And despite appearances to the contrary on this panel, there is oppression of women. It is increasingly clear that our financial system is not working. It's reinforcing inequality, it's driving bad decisions, it's not serving the planet, it's not serving the people, and it's not serving investors. We need a new way of doing business. We need a financial system that is more inclusive and accountable for its effects on people and the planet. The good news is that people around the world are demanding this change, and they are more engaged in social and environmental issues than ever before. They are insisting on action. They want to be part of the solution, especially the millennials. Think of Felix, who spoke in this room yesterday. And this is beginning to translate into their investment decisions. More and more people are expecting their investments to reflect their values. For want of a better phrase, I'm going to use the term impact investing. And it has become clear that investors of all types are choosing to invest more sustainably and more responsibly. In short, there are some pretty strong forces calling for change. We will nevertheless require a pretty sharp acceleration in the trajectory of financing. To create a better future, we need to aim for a complete transformation of the market in which all investments account for social and environmental impact and help to fill the resourcing gap for the SDGs. And we need to pull in the conventional financial markets. We need to raise the bar for all investments. It's quite likely that the status quo remains rather entrenched. There are many powerful vested interests in the current system, and they will continue to resist change. And it's just simpler to maintain business as usual. Why change if you don't absolutely have to? But to do that means that you are remaining willfully ignorant of the long-term implications of those bad decisions. So to succeed, we need to offer a better alternative for the way the world invests. We need to make impact a part of every investment. Investment decisions in landscapes will be amongst the most powerful and impactful ways of bringing this alternative to the table. As I said, it's going to require systemic change. Just driving up impact finance wouldn't mean very much if the broader system continued to fail. So how do we build this powerful alternative to the status quo? I'm going to put two things on the table, but I think the panel will come with others. First, we need to mobilize more capital. We need to bring more investors in to unlock more money for the right kinds of investments. We need to engage everyone, from boutique firms to the major global institutions, from the high net worth individuals to the retail investors. We also need to accept that public finance will have a role to play, but the bulk of finance is going to have to come from the private sector, from the capital markets, because that is where the big money is. The second thing is around integrity. We have to fight for integrity of our investments. We need to establish those strong values and expectations, and we need to ensure that we achieve impact at scale, not just capital at scale. That ultimately is the purpose of this panel. So without further ado, let's get them to work. You were told earlier about the Slido slide. These are potential challenges which you might face investment and in integrated landscapes. Make your vote now, if you wouldn't mind, and then we're going to ask you to vote again at the end of the panel to see whether your thinking has changed as a result of the panel. I'm going to start, if I may. You can see we have 3 continents represented. We have 3 private entrepreneurs at the table. We have 1 public sector specialist. So we have really a very strong business acumen in this panel. Let me start, if I may, with Ada Osakwe, who is a award-winning food entrepreneur, and a very passionate agribusiness advocate in Africa, in Nigeria. And she's the chief executive of AgroLay Ventures. Something you won't see in her printed agenda is that she used to paint a lot, and she rather wishes that she had more time to paint now. I'm going to ask each of the panelists, starting with Ada, to give you 4 or 5 minutes, set out their shop, and then we will come back with some questions.
Great, thanks, Chris. And it's a pleasure to be here talking about an issue that's very passionate, that I feel very passionate about. Having built a career in finance over the last few years, it's, starting off in investment banking and then going on to development finance, where I worked with the African Development Bank in Tunisia for about 5 years, investing in private equity funds, investing in forestry projects, investing in agribusiness, investing in infrastructure. I started forming my ideas on how, typically development finance had been working. I then transitioned into private equity, where as a fund manager, we were investing in entrepreneurs on the ground in Africa. I said, okay, this is quite interesting. Now this is money being put to work for folks to then specifically take equity in a business, have a shareholding, and make things work. Okay, this seems, fine. We're moving the needle with regards to development. But I still was feeling a bit antsy in the way things were shaping out. And I'll come to that in a bit. I then went on to work in public sector. I became a senior advisor on investments to the Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria. So this really was my first foray into agriculture, landscapes, smallholder farmers. And for me, it was very, very transformational. As someone who had done a lot of work on the continent, I was so blown away with the fact that Africa had over 200 million hectares of arable land, 60% of it, that we should be farming. We had a youthful population, and yet there was still so much unproductive use of this asset. There was still so much poverty amongst the 80% of the people who were actually farming and growing our food, the smallholder farmers. And, I had to ask myself, why is this happening? Why is it that there have been so many interventions, especially from the financing side, from institutions like the African Development Bank, from institutions, many public sector institutions as well, going into increasing the productivity of the smallholder farmer? And why is it that there's still this vicious cycle of poverty? And I just really had to start thinking about new approaches to how we put capital to work. Why is it that Africa was still spending over $40 billion annually importing food that we can produce right there on our lands? Yet the richest and the biggest companies in the world are food companies, many of them right there in Nigeria, yet they're not using the raw materials coming from our lands. So these were things that I got really passionate about, and I said, from a financing perspective, we had to change. And unlike you, Chris, you said one of the things was that we need to mobilize more capital. I think there's enough capital. There's enough capital around right now. It's just that how are we placing this, and how are we making it work in the areas that make sense? And for me, if we want to pull that smallholder farmer out of poverty, if we want to ensure that there's equitable distribution of wealth, if we want to make sure there's shared prosperity from the producer of that food to the consumer of that food, we have to do a lot more across the value chain. We have to ensure that we are buying from that farmer. It's not about increasing productivity and just giving them better seeds so that they have better yields. No, they get better yields, and then what? They hold on to that produce until the price crashes again because they have nowhere to store it, or they don't have a producer, an agro-processor to buy it from them. So that's really what changed my mindset. And towards the end of the time I was working in the government, I worked with my former boss. He became the president of the African Development Bank. And many people thought, Ada, are you going to Abidjan? Are you going to become some big person in the organization? And I said, no, I'm going to stay put here in Nigeria. I'm going to build a business that invests in early stage food businesses. agriculture business, but note the word I used, food. I use food because really that's where that's the game changer. Agriculture is the science of it and how we get that raw material, but food is really where 70% of the value is. And when we think about Africa, I'm tired of seeing panels and stuff that say agriculture, oh, women in agriculture. Why is it that? But when I'm in New York, I never hear that word agriculture. Or when I'm here in Germany, I hear food, food tech. That's where everybody gets really excited. So we have to create those markets and draw, because it's only when you create those markets that the farmer, that smallholder farmer, builds wealth. And that's really what I'm focused on. Apart from investing in those businesses, I decided to roll up my sleeves, and one of my companies, Newly, which I serve as the CEO, we buy fruits and vegetables from farmers, from smallholder farmers. We started making them into cold-pressed juices that you can find, as good as anything right here. And we also started a chain of restaurants that use only local produce, indigenously grown produce to basically serve the consumer. So we have 5 outlets now, and by early next year, we'll have about 8 of those. So very excited about pushing for shared prosperity and changing the mindset and framing this question around agriculture, but focusing instead on food.
Thank you, Ada, very much. That's good. I'm going to stay on the painting theme now. And I'm going to go to Durin Shanaz, who is another reformed investment banker, if I can put it that way, seen the light and has decided to turn her skill set, has become a serial entrepreneur, has launched a couple of companies in Asia, and has become quite a leader in the impact investment space. And to clarify, her particular painting is Chinese brush painting.
Thank you. Yes, I do love it. It doesn't need much patience. You just do it. So, because I'm very impatient.
I sense that might work for you.
Yes, it works. It works for me.
Go, dear.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you, for all of you for having us here today, and big thanks to GLF and C4 for inviting us. I guess very briefly, as Chris mentioned about my background, I'm actually from Bangladesh, so it was a rather unusual I would say, journey to end up in Morgan Stanley 30 years ago. There were hardly any women, trust me, no one from Bangladesh. I did that for a few years and actually went back to Bangladesh and worked at a small bank giving loans to the women. And this was Grameen Bank in its early days. So what that did was really, that experience of going from Wall Street to the back streets really shaped my thinking in terms of how to really bring these two worlds together. So my first attempt at that was my first company, One Nest, which was back in '99, one of the first online marketplaces, and I grew that, and I sold it in 2004. But what stayed with me was the fact that the investors really didn't care about the impact that One Nest created, and the 500,000 women that we got out of poverty, or the supply chains that we created connecting these markets, to the buyers. So I think I just sort of at that point, I felt literally sort of a tree falling in the forest, and it didn't really matter what I did. So that got me into actually academia, always a good place to lick your wounds, and started really doing research on how to measure impact. And that really was the beginning of my next company, Impact Investment Exchange. To put it sort of broadly, there are 3 things I really focused on, and I would say we focused on it very much so from the very beginning. First was value. Giving value to actually the social impact that was being created, quantifying that, and giving value to the environmental impact that was being created, and linking that value to actually the financial products. So the value was one. The second thing was defiance. I had no help from any government. We didn't have help from anyone except for Rockefeller Foundation, who is an amazing foundation when it comes to innovation. And that was really it. For us, really showing the defiance that we're going to change the financial markets to make it work from everyone. And lastly was really optimism, the fact that we could do it. And we still can, and we still are after 10 years. So what have we done? We have now created a parallel social capital markets. We have incubators, accelerators. We do technical assistance in getting organizations which are bringing clean water, which are actually helping in reforestation, which are helping in bringing clean cook stoves to the women. We basically get not only the technical assistance and creating the value that they are creating in the market, but then getting capital into them. So we actually operate now the world's largest equity crowdfunding platform, and we have unlocked over $70 million on that. We then started creating structured products. We have launched last year the world's ever first fixed income instrument, a bond, focused on women's livelihood. And I always say capital markets has been around for 800 years. First stock exchange was created in Belgium, in Bruges. And we have sadly traded everything, starting from human beings to commodity to everything. But we never had women. We never had the back streets be connected to the Wall Street. So for me, it was a very personal thing. So we created Women's Livelihood Bond, which is now creating livelihood for 385,000 women across Southeast Asia. And the success of that pilot, which was an $8 million, is now allowing us to do a $100 million bond, Women's Livelihood Bond 2. And of course, sort of capping all this, we also created a social stock exchange with the Mauritian government. So if you step back, one thing I want you all to take away, and it's been interesting for me to spend the last 2 days with all of you, I mean, incredible work, incredible minds, is the fact that we have to be defiant in what we're trying to achieve. And we have to, of course, the governments are there, but we can do it in spite of the governments as well, which we proved that it can happen. But of course, it's wonderful to have the governments there. But anyway, I think, it's good news is work is happening, and the fact that the social and the environmental impact is being measured and is being valued by the market.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So we've moved down the line now, and we're moving away from the kind of standalone, hard-nosed private sector into a more blended finance area. It doesn't mean that it's not disciplined. It doesn't mean that it's not market-driven, but it does mean that we're mixing the resources a little bit now to break new ground, I think is probably the right way of putting it. So let me go to Sylvia first, if I may, who is the Managing Director of Finance in Motion, which is one of the global leaders in impact finance, covers a lot of different sectors, based out of Frankfurt, and offices in 16 different countries now. She will hopefully introduce it. I'm going to be a little bit indiscreet and tell you that she's got a problem with her local water company, who doesn't believe the amount of water that her household of 4 is consuming, and gets her meter checked every year as a result to make sure she hasn't fixed it. The reason is because she has a very efficient rainwater catchment system, and she can reduce her average consumption for a family of 4 by 75%, and therefore she's only taking 25% off the grid. But it does make her still an object of suspicion. So we need to mainstream you, Sylvia.
Yeah, thanks for this very personal introduction. And let me perhaps kick off also with a personal statement of my background, because certainly Chris portrayed me here as being the investor here in the room, but actually I kicked off, or started my career in German technical corporations. So I was basically working with public sector funding, always working with the private sector, but basically just some sort of being in charge of grant programs where, my success was spending euros with the private sector. And at a certain point I thought, well, wouldn't it be great to also pull in the private sector as investors into this and not just as recipients of capacity building grant funding? And this is how actually my journey into blended finance then started. And I will share with you a little bit the experience that we've accumulated over the last 10 years in structuring and managing blended finance structures. And you heard already the technical term of structured funds. And perhaps a question to you in the audience: who has ever managed or invested into a structured fund? Hands up. Who perhaps out of your
It's in one
own...
hand.
Okay. Then perhaps before I go into our experience, just a little bit, how actually our blended structures work. And I guess most of you are familiar with the very famous German Black Forest double cream cake. Hands up. Who knows the that's much better. Great. That's much, much better. Okay, so those of you who have ever eaten a piece of it, you know that it comes with multiple layers. So you have, the biscuit piece, and then the double cream piece, and the cherry piece, and then another biscuit piece, etc., etc. And this is how you need to basically think about layered funds or structured funds. So you have these multiple capital layers. At the foundation, you have the so-called first loss piece, which is generally capital contributed by the public sector. Then you have a middle piece of mezzanine financing, which is often contributed by the multilateral development organizations, MDBs, international finance institutions. And then on top you have the private sector, institutional investor in our case. And generally, you would eat your cake top down, right? I mean, you obviously start with the cherry first. At least that's how I eat the cake. But in this cake of the layered funds, actually, it's the other way around. So you put all these capital together, blend it, merge it, invest it. And in case there is a loss, meaning money doesn't come back, actually it eats into that first loss piece, meaning the donor, in a way, takes that risk, that capital loss risk. Which means that then those private investors which sit in the upper layer of the cake actually are protected from losses. And this is the way how public money is actually being used to de-risk private sector investments, because we're speaking here about countries where private capital would not normally invest. For example, we have been active in countries like Yemen, El Salvador, Ukraine, and others. So that does not necessarily lend to a private investor to go there with its own capital, unless there is such a protection in place. And we're also working in sectors which are rather early stage markets. For example, investments in landscapes. That's not a typical investment proposition for a private investor. So what we're trying to achieve through these kind of structures is to de-risk such investments. On the one side, take away the notion, because often we have a perceived risk issue, that we believe that these investments are intact, that they're sustainable economically, but also environmentally and socially, but not necessarily an investor may look at it in the same way as we do. But we also have to accept that there are real risks also out there. I mean, particularly when we go into landscape, we're dealing with land. And as you all know, and we have also made quite interesting experience with that, is you have multiple layers of land ownership, but also of land usage systems, which complicates investments. At the same time, when we invest into landscapes, we have a very long time horizon. I mean, we're talking about 10 years plus. And obviously, that combined with emerging markets or early sector development, that means, again, a lot of things can happen in 10 years or more. Again, a real risk that investors are worried about. So you may now ask, well, has your model worked? Have you mobilized, the capital that you wanted to? When you started with these kind of blended structures, and when we started about 10 years ago, we started off with around 300 million assets under management. Today, we're at 2 billion. And just this year alone, we mobilized 200 million roundabout euros from the private sector alone. So you can argue, yes, we have proven that these models really work and attract private capital. And I think we're in a particularly interesting moment right now because we see actually a lot of private capital coming into the impact investment space for various reasons. Obviously, we see the current interest rate environment helping us because investors look for alternatives. They are open to consider other options. Secondly, though, we also recognize that many of the investors look at sustainable investment opportunities. There is a paradigm shift. Look at, for example, the Dutch pension funds, which came out with very clear statements that they don't want to basically invest money in compromising basically the future's generation's future. And they, for example, look very heavily now at impact investment possibilities. So I think we're really at a very interesting sweet spot where private investors are interested to bring money. But now, coming here from perhaps the very positive side of things, on the liability side, where we think, yes, private investor interest is there, plus the financial engineering can be done. But now, just very briefly to wind up on the asset side, how to spend that money. And obviously, we've put a lot of thinking around how to spend this money to really drive systemic change, as Chris also put it in his introduction. And we, a little bit different to where Doreen started off, we deliberately didn't want to create a parallel system in terms of we as foreign investors come in, look for investments, place the money, transaction by transaction. But if we want to move really the needle towards systemic change locally, we need to bring the largest players into the equation that allocate capital locally, and this is the local financial sector. So otherwise, we may feel happy about how we spend our money, but next door, the big players, the big banks there may still continue doing not so nice things. So that's why we thought it's a very powerful component in really collaborating and working with the financial sector. And again, there we find increasingly sweet spots when it comes to landscape investments, because what they're noticing is that their own license to operate is at stake given climate change considerations. So in that sense, we actually are very much positively looking forward that with these blended structures, we can really move the needle forward.
Thank you, Sylvia. Another interesting and contrasting way of doing basically the same final outcome. Last but by no means least, Jane Feehan, my ex-colleague from the European Investment Bank, where they host something called the Natural Capital Finance Facility, which is what Jane leads on, and is a different model again. She's a biologist by training, but I'd learned the other day that she's also a taxonomist. When I first read it, I said it's taxidermy. Is that the right place for a taxidermist? But turned out to be taxonomy. I learned from her that there's a butterfly called charismatic. So with that thought, let me introduce you to Jane.
Thank you very much, Chris. Yes, I must say it's a real pleasure to be here on this marvelous panel and to have an opportunity to speak to you this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know about you, but my December wouldn't be the same without the Global Landscapes Forum. I've been coming back year after year. So as Chris explained, I have a background as a biologist and a forest engineer. I'm a loan officer with the European Investment Bank, and I work on our investments in natural capital. The European Investment Bank, we're the EU's long-term lending bank. We're based in Luxembourg. And as the name implies, we do mostly invest in Europe. 90% of our investments are in Europe, 10% further afield around the world. And our role is to support EU policy with our loans and investments wherever we act. We're investing around 80 billion euros per year. And when it comes to sustainable landscapes, when it comes to natural capital, we do a number of things. 25% of all of our investments are in climate action projects, or projects which have a measurable benefit to climate action, either mitigation or adaptation. We're doing at least 1 billion euros a year in sustainable forestry. And amongst the many other things that we do, we also work on helping with the structuring and investing in the kinds of layered funds which Sylvia has been describing, where we see that there is a market failure, there is a policy need for us to invest in this area in order to send a signal to the market, in order to foster the development of a new market, and really to show commercial banks who will hopefully invest along with us, to show them this is a market which needs to be built. There is a commercial business case here. We are going in. Follow us. So to really send that signal and to invest in areas where there is a need to inspire the private sector to invest more. And indeed, picking up on the point that Chris made, one of the points that Chris made in his introduction, we need to accept that public finance has a role, but the bulk of the investments need to come from the private sector. And the UN Convention on Biological Diversity has, I believe, estimated that between 150 and 440 billion dollars a year are needed globally to successfully meet the Aichi targets. But only about 53 or 54 billion dollars a year are going into sustainable landscapes and other investments which can contribute to the Aichi targets and biodiversity management. So, massive shortfall. A lot of that 53 is public money, and the rest does indeed need to be met by the private sector. So what are we doing in the EIB to meet this important policy need and indeed the commercial opportunity? So one of the things we're doing is we have developed and we're bringing to market our natural capital financing facility, where we aim to invest in projects which have a measurable benefit to biodiversity conservation and nature-based solutions for climate adaptation. And this, of course, includes investing in sustainable landscapes. In fact, that's a very important part of it. And in doing that, I mean, I'm happy to say that we're really getting somewhere with this now. We've signed 4 deals. We're about to sign a 5th. This represents a third of our 150 million euros that we have to put into this. And it's a start. It's a good start. In doing this, as Sylvia said, let's distinguish between the real risk of doing this and the perceived risk of doing this. And in actually building this pipeline and showing what we're actually investing in, who we're investing with, and what those investments actually comprise on the ground, doing this and getting it off the ground is, in a meaningful way, tackling that perceived risk. And this is something which I think we need to do as robustly as we can. Maybe I'll stop there, but during the course of our conversation, I look forward to telling you more.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you.
Looking at the organisers, can I have 5 extra minutes? Thank you, good. Okay, so that gives us 10 minutes to go then. Jane, let me stick with you a second then. From your vantage point and, you know, with the network of EIB relations into all sorts of funds, and by the way, EIB does invest not only in the layered funds, the structured funds, but in a whole string of private equity vehicles as well, some of which are very active in the forestry space, hopefully sustainably. But from your vantage point, where do you see the sort of greatest progress that has been made? What can we be encouraged by in the last 12 months, 24 months?
Okay, thanks, Chris. Yes, so progress since this time last year, indeed. I would point to a number of things. One would be, I mean, as I said, you know, this facility that I'm responsible for myself, that the fact that we have really begun to really sign a critical mass of operations. This allows us to tell the story of what the commercial opportunity looks like in this area. And telling that story is very powerful and very important. And I've heard this mentioned actually in the previous sessions today. The power of being able to tell that story and to do so robustly. So building the deal flow is helping us to do that. So I think for this particular area of work of the European Investment Bank, we're making some meaningful progress. Now, however, I would say though that during the last 12 months, indeed there are some breaks on our progress and some recurring problems that are holding us back indeed. And these have been very visible in our work over the past year, notwithstanding the positive story we have to tell. One of those issues is that many of these deals are very small, a lot smaller than what we usually do. And consequently, there are very high transaction costs, or very high proportion of transaction costs with those deals. And that's difficult for us as an institution. Many of these deals also have quite low returns. And again, we find that we have to do a very strong selling job internally to press ahead with some of these deals. It's all very well to say that, well, yes, look at the bigger picture, look at the wider impacts. But if that doesn't really translate into a bottom line internally to help us pay back the costs of operating a facility like this, it makes it difficult. Limited pipeline is also an issue. When we're building something new, doing something new, the number of eligible and bankable opportunities that are out there is limited in this early stage. So we've got to tackle each of these problems one by one. And for sure, dealing with the perceived risk is helping. And I would just make one additional point, kind of outside the EIB. Something which is helping us externally is a very, very important development in the European Union, which will have global repercussions. And this is the European Union's Sustainable Finance Package, a package of very important legislation which is being pushed through and implemented. And this, we see, is actually shifting the dial in a very important way at board level, at Ministry of Finance level, actually broadening, redefining what fiduciary responsibility actually means to include elements of natural capital and climate, other areas, biodiversity impact. This is really, really important. And I have to say, I'm very pleased that there is this big push coming from outside the EIB, but this big push is going in the right direction, and let's surf that wave.
Thank you. 45 minutes isn't nearly enough for a panel with this talent, but Sylvia, one very quick answer, if you wouldn't mind. You, queen of the blended vehicles, if I may call you that, what do you think we could do differently in that space to scale them up, to make them bigger, have them have a bigger impact?
Yeah, I think there are multiple things, and I use the opportunity that we're close to Christmas, perhaps, to put my own wish list out to you here in the room. Just very quickly, I think one important component is timing. When, for example, private sector comes in, they want to invest now. Sometimes we are then struggling a little bit, in bringing the other capital layers, into place on time. And for example, we just this year went through, in that sense, a pretty challenging experience where actually we had all the private sector investors lined up and they stood ready to sign and bring the capital, but we didn't have, all the public sector and the international financial institutions ready. So I think timing is one, let's say, big plea to some sort of try to make it work quickly, which I know is a challenge. With the public sector here, and they're respecting, obviously, their fiduciary responsibility to taxpayers. On the other side, what we are seeing is, and I come back to what Jane just said, pipeline building. It's not that these deals are ready-made and just wait for you to be picked up. Often we are actually co-developers, so we are together with the local entrepreneurs, with the local stakeholders, we're actually structuring together the project. So I think we also need to, in addition to the patient capital that we have in the investment funds, also continue to mobilize funds to actually support incubating, accelerating activities, but also technical assistance or pilot testing certain business cases to bring them to a level of maturity that we can invest them at larger scale.
Got it. Excellent. I had a quickie for you, if I may, please. You've obviously engaged with smallholders in your different parts of your career. Mm-hmm. What do you, and again, I'm sorry, only a minute answer, but what do you think we should do differently as regards smallholder financing in Africa?
I think we should move away maybe from Africa. I remember when I was in government and we set up a risk guarantee scheme, because at the time banks were only, agriculture only accounted for 5% of the bank's portfolio. So we said, okay, let's come as a government, let's guarantee this and be that first loss, and it did increase, and they didn't have any NPLs from agriculture. But then I found that when you have those government interventions, it's not sustainable. So when we talk about bringing private capital in, it's not just about bringing more money, but it's for sustainability. So while I was in the government, we worked with actually KfW, the German Development Bank, and we designed a private equity fund that government actually seeded. So this is another form of blended finance where the government was the anchor investor. We put $20 million in, and then KfW put some money in, and the intention there was for us to leverage private capital for them to see that we can do this, and it was investing in the value chain. So I think that was something that was really exciting to see. But I think finally what I want to see going forward, and that's what we work on in AgroLay, is more early stage capital. So while Jane is saying that it's a problem for you as a big institution, EIB, you find only small ticket size deals, I just believe that's so essential. So if it's not the EIB changing your model, or the African Development Bank changing their model, or the World Bank to say, okay, let's do smaller ticket sizes of $1 million or $500,000, for example, as opposed to 50 million or 100 million. Let's set up those sorts of entities that can do early stage, smaller ticket sizes, so that we can start making a true impact on the ground with the smallholders, with the SMEs in agribusiness, in landscapes for sustainability. And it's only the private sector that would ensure the sustainability over time. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Doreen, I began my comments with a rather cheeky remark about women, so I hope you've forgiven me for that now. But a serious answer, please, from you. What the role of women in climate change and in landscapes, for that matter, obviously fundamental both in terms of influencing and suffering, paying the consequences of it. Your thoughts on what we should be doing a little bit differently? And sorry to say this, but a minute if you can.
Well, I think the thing is, as we have seen, with our work, I mean, we have various investment platforms, and now we're doing this, structured bond financing, which again also has actually layers and all the various de-risking. One of the big things is that despite all the conversation about gender and gender equality, what is very interesting for us to see is the fact that in reality, when it actually comes to putting money in, actual investment money, it actually takes a lot of work to get the investors in there. So I would actually really request to whoever is in the audience, if you're in the government, if you're with the European Union and all that, do try to think beyond what's happening, with probably in Europe or the developed markets. But look at the markets we are operating in. We are creating these structured products, and we are seeing that there are investors there for it. But we do need de-risking methods, which we are also putting in place to bring women front and center. Because without women, frankly, I don't think there'll be any planet left.
But when I look at this panel, I think there's hope for the planet. Christmas, New Year, nearly upon us. Sylvia already sort of took a pitch in that direction with her Christmas list, but a 3-word answer from each of you. What's the top of the list for you, your Christmas wish list? I don't mind who wants to go first. Jane looks as though she might be ready. Good,
yeah,
Jane.
That I don't want to be called innovative anymore. I want to be called, a good idea and the right thing to do. I want our facility to be not called innovative, but a great idea and the right thing to do. There.
No
it wasn't
more
3
innovation.
words.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I think I already used, my wish list, let's say, capacity.
I'm giving you a second chance if you want it. I'll come back to you. Ada.
Quick off the top of my head, maybe something I started off earlier on saying, when we think about Africa and we think about the space of agriculture, we should look at food, as opposed to framing it as agriculture and, that sort of thing. So let's frame it as a food business.
Food business, okay.
Yeah.
Putting women front and center, just not what we're doing in Asia, but globally, and putting a value to it, which we are doing, and digitizing it all.
I don't think we could ask for a better note to finish on. Thank you very much indeed. Please, in the usual way. So, if I could encourage you to leave, my sole remaining task is to complete the gender balance of this panel and to introduce to you Jo Puri, who is from the Green Climate Fund and who is going to now deliver the keynote speech. And thank you very much indeed for your time and attention, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. I need a clicker.
I need a clicker. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session, and it's really a huge privilege for me to be here. I'm Jo, and I work for the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund. I'm going to take off where Chris actually left off and think about what I'd want as part of my Christmas and New Year wish list. And this is something that I've thought about a lot, given that I belong to a fairly new office, which was established last year when I joined the Green Climate Fund, called the Independent Evaluation Unit. This reports to the board of the GCF. And the main mandate of the office is really to think about what we can do to make GCF faster, smarter, better. So faster, smarter, better is basically what I think about all the time. Okay, and given the challenges of evidence and evaluation, well, evidence more so than anything else, we're constantly thinking about, well, what works? Whether it's private finance, whether it's public finance, whether it's policy, whether it's implementation, we're constantly thinking about that. There are a lot of challenges, as you know, when we think about evidence in climate change. And the ladies before me spoke and alluded to some of that. They spoke about impact investing. That is a huge challenge. Just knowing what is the total impact, and especially when you're trying to think about co-benefits, is a huge challenge. Challenges in climate change and production of evidence are really related in many, many ways. Impacts are too far, our discount factors are very high, we have complicated objectives, we have a complex environment, landscapes are complex, the environment is complex, climate change is complex. Given all of that, how do you think about impact, and how do you think about measuring it? Public good, yeah, the public good and the tragedy of the commons is pretty well known. There are trade-offs. How do we think about trade-offs, and can we try and measure them? In many cases, especially with climate change and with assessments, a lot of these events occur suddenly. Can we think about what to do in the face of them, especially if we're not ready with evidence? What changes behavior? And how do we deal with probability? It's a challenge for me constantly within the fund, but also outside when we are thinking and trying to communicate probabilities. And last but not least, climate change and doing work in the environment, given that it is a public good, really has a large number, small payoff problem, right? And so in the context of that, what can we do better? And there are three things that I'm going to talk about today, and these are the 3 Bs: bias, benefits, and behavior. Yeah? So let's start with the first one, and this is bias. In a lot of evidence that we see, especially when we are thinking about what works for whom, why, and under what circumstances, there is a lot of bias. Bias comes in analysis, and biases come in interpretation. In analysis, you've got attrition bias, sampling bias, spillover bias, placement bias, et cetera, and we can talk about this. But really, when we are thinking about interpreting evidence, and that's really the big trick, yeah, there's availability bias. People only tend to look at what is available. There's anchoring bias. It really depends on where you're starting off from. In pieces of work that have been done previously, how you sequence your question. So if I ask you, are you happy? And your second question is, are you dating? Your responses are going to be highly uncorrelated. But if I reverse it and ask you, are you dating and are you happy, your responses are going to be extremely correlated, because people tend to think that happiness is correlated with your dating life. Yeah? So that's essentially the anchoring problem. And then, of course, you have confirmation bias. That is, you are looking constantly for evidence that seeks to confirm what you already think is true. And this is the problem with most evidence. I'll talk a little bit about this as we go along. Now, very quickly, and thinking about evidence, if I was to ask you, what are the 4 top things that you can do to individually reduce greenhouse gas emissions? I'm not going to ask you now, but, well, OK, any responses? What can you individually do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
Eat less meat.
Eat less meat. Very good. Anyone else? Not flying. So, yes, not flying, well, fewer children, living car-free, avoiding one transatlantic flight. We're doing very well there. Consuming a plant-based diet. Yeah, these were the top 4 things that systematic review, over systematic review, have basically found are really good in reducing greenhouse gas emissions individually. And the amount of greenhouse gas emissions range from 29 tons per person per year for consuming a plant-based diet to 59 tons per person per year having fewer children. Yeah? And of course, again, this is for a group of countries. This was done in developed countries, etc. But the important thing is that many agencies don't think about what it is that can cause maximum impact. We all come from our starting points, and there's a bias there. We are path dependent depending on where we started off from. This is really important, especially for evidence and for evaluations, because in most of these, we don't talk about what is most effective. In fact, we constantly look at how we are doing things. So we are not asking the question, are we doing the right things? But we are asking the question, are we doing things right? And that's unfortunate because a lot of agencies, a lot of companies, a lot of individuals tend to be path dependent depending on where they're starting off from. Given all of that, I also quickly want to show you some evidence. So this is work that my co-authors and I did in 2016, and now we are updating it with our colleagues from C4, including Amy. Hi there. And we are looking at updating this work on, well, what works in land use change and what can we do? And we looked at area management techniques, we looked at law enforcement, we looked at incentives, and a whole lot of other things along an evidence gap map. We basically found that, yes, you could look at a lot of studies, and there are 221 studies that found their way into an evidence gap map. But guess what? Only 2 studies looked at cost effectiveness. And there were 0 studies that essentially took us from action and interventions on one side to measuring how much of greenhouse gas emission reduction it was leading to. There is bias in what we produce in terms of evidence as well. And we need to be cognizant of this. So, lesson 1, let's consider bias in how we produce evidence and how we use it as well. The second thing I really want to talk about are benefits. Yeah? And this relates to a whole lot of evidence, but I'm going to talk about a couple of things that I worked on and then some other work that others have done. So this is work that I did with co-authors, and we looked at road construction and whether it always led to deforestation. And again, confirmation bias, we could have very well concluded that, of course, road construction is going to lead to deforestation and then stop there. Except we worked through this and found a few things. Very precisely, a 10% reduction in agricultural costs that was caused by road construction led to reduction in upland rice area as well as increase in soybean. Overall, basically, what we found was that there was increased agricultural profitability and reduced deforestation. These kind of win-win options have been found in a lot of studies. So environmental and livelihood benefits are available and possible in many cases, except we don't sufficiently look at the magnitudes of these changes for us to know as to what's happening on the ground. It's really important to think about sizes of change when we are looking at our evidence. And we don't do that sufficiently. I'm going to also show you, and I think you may have seen this. This was a group of studies that was published that was undertaken by C4 and was published in PLOS One, which looked at the effect of policies on forest cover compared across different spatial contexts. And basically the study found that the overall effects range from 0 to 0.5 percentage points of forest policies. Now, you might think this is very small. Actually, if you consider the cost that you have to put in, as well as the avoided deforestation beyond the time of intervention, these are fairly cost-effective interventions, except very few studies look at costs of interventions. So, my second takeaway is size is important. Let's measure effect sizes and costs, because we don't do that sufficiently currently. Okay. The third thing that I'd really like us to focus on is behavior, and ensuring that we measure the last mile, what works for the last mile. Yeah? We've seen a lot of science out there, a lot of science that tells us how to prevent obesity, how to reduce drug use, how to reduce alcoholism, smoking, etc. The thing is that clearly science is not enough, and we need to do more. And this is something where a lot of behavioral economics and behavioral science has started to make a dent, except we don't do enough of it in our own discipline. In environment, in climate change, we don't do sufficient amounts in this space. So, energy programs, recycling, tax collections, land use, insurance policies, programs, they all suffer from one common problem. So this crop insurance is especially something that, again, co-authors of mine and I looked at in a few years ago. And we found that in a lot of crop insurance programs, despite crop insurance programs and packages being actuarially fair, despite them being fair, the uptake of crop insurance among smallholder farmers was not more than 30% at a maximum. 30% was basically considered a success. Overarchingly, we found that this average rate of uptake was about 15 to 18% as part of our meta-analysis. This basically points to a last mile problem. Yes, we can have agencies that think about policies that put programs out there, but we have to do something about people changing their behavior so that they can start to think about making that small but critical change when we are thinking about climate change, the landscape, as well as environment. So, addressing the last mile, and this is excellent work now, of course. A lot of you are aware of work done by Kahneman, Tversky, Richard Taylor, Cass Sunstein, etc., is really pitting the cognitive versus context and changing the choice architecture. And we need to start thinking along those lines as we think about designing policies as well as delivering them. Okay. So this is an example that I like to cite, and this is work that was done by the University of Miami along with Imperial College. It basically helps to underscore for me that clearly science is not sufficient. Doctors know that they need to wash their hands before they go into a surgery room. A big study that was done in the 1990s found that in the United States alone, 100,000 deaths were caused because doctors just don't wash their hands going from one surgery room into the other. So clearly, it's not the science, because doctors of all people should know that not washing hands is going to lead to greater mortality or morbidity or both. Yeah? So it's something else. So what these researchers did is they said, okay, well, what can inspire them to change their behavior? And they ended up installing or experimenting with a hand sanitizer put at the entrance of surgery rooms. So that was essentially what constituted their control group. But then they also did a few other tweaks in the choice environment and found that if they could tweak the environment by putting, women's eyes, men's eyes, etc., to see whether that changed behavior. And this has been found now with loan programs as well. Bertrand et al. Looked at this in South Africa and found that putting a pretty girl's face on an advertisement that solicited people to apply for loans was equivalent to reducing interest rates by 30%. So, okay, so here what the researchers did was that they looked at three things. They looked at men's eyes, then women's eyes, and then the third thing was they sprayed a lemon scent in front of the surgery door. Here are the results. So just installing this hand sanitizer in the control group led to a 15 percentage point increase in hand sanitizing behavior. Male eyes led to a 33% increase, which basically means over the control group, that was an 18 percentage point increase, right? Female eyes were not as effective. Women are not as effective in getting people to adhere to, or women's eyes were not. But what was interesting for me was that the olfactory nudge, so to speak, spraying a lemon scent nudged the brain of these doctors to think about cleaning the hands or applying some antiseptic solution to it before they went into surgery rooms. And this is over and above, so they saw 47% increase, and over the control group, that's a 32 percentage point increase. Yeah? So that's pretty big, and this sort of change in choice architecture is clearly something that we need to build upon and leverage as we go forward. This is a lot of work now that's been done across the world, and a lot of developed countries are thinking about it. Unfortunately, not so much in the developing world. Yeah? Behavioral science and the last mile problem. And here are a few more examples of it. When you compare, and this is work that's been done by the Behavioral Insights Unit, when you compare your energy usage with others living in the same neighborhood, people tend to reduce their own energy usage depending on how other people around them are behaving. They also looked at tax receipts. And they found, but most people are not malicious. It's not that they want to jump taxes. It's just that they forget. I forget to file my taxes. So a letter basically just saying that, look, people receiving this letter end up, 9 out of 10 people receiving this letter end up paying their taxes on time, increased tax receipts by 15% over the control group. Just that. And this is something, again, that hasn't been utilized enough when we're trying to mobilize finance from the public sector to contribute to things like a global good. Last couple of slides. Yeah, thanks. So a couple of things here that you may have heard of. The first thing is clearly changing the default helps to alter the choice architecture that we can and should be leveraging. And this is a classic case of organ donation in the United States. Priming, getting people to pick up smaller plates rather than larger plates makes them eat less, even if they're at a buffet. Yeah? Salience, so getting people to first deal with fresh fruit and then putting the donuts far away gets them to eat more fresh fruit. Yeah? And ego. So this is my favorite example. At Halloween, and these researchers basically looked at children's behavior at Halloween. When children in the treatment group were asked as to what their names and their addresses were, and both groups of children were told that they should only eat one piece of candy, the treatment group, where children had been asked their names and their addresses, were much more likely to eat one piece of candy compared to children whose names and addresses were not asked, because you were appealing to their ego. Just as an aside, children who also were facing candy boxes where there was a mirror placed at the back, where they could see their faces, also tended to eat much less candy. Yeah. So appealing to ego definitely changes behavior as well. So lesson 3, let's think about the last mile and what changes behavior. And that's my summary. Consider bias in how we produce and use evidence. Size matters. Let's measure effect sizes and costs. And think about the last mile and what changes behavior. And to end, much like the environment, happiness is a complex thing. Yeah? Many different things make us happy. But we know some things that make people happy. And there was a study that was done in 2003 that looked at one treatment group that was made to write down every day as to things that they are grateful for every day for a period of 10 days. And another group that was either told to recount the bad things that were happening every day or were left alone. Not surprisingly, people in the first group, in the treatment group, ended up being far happier just because they could recount as to the good things that were happening in their lives every day because they were grateful for it. Yeah? So choose to be grateful, and it will make you happier. With that, I'm grateful. And thank you so much for having me here.